Today on The Nation Speaks, Democrats aren't giving up on the $15 minimum wage. Who wins, who loses if it goes through? Into Alabama, Amazon workers want to unionize. The man who wrote the book on Amazon explains the real reason Jeff Bezos is so against it. Next, we go inside San Quentin maximum security prison with a filmmaker and an ex-felon to see the amazing impact of restorative justice. And on America Q&A, we ask people across the country what they think about the federal minimum wage and what pandemic-related changes they think are going to stick around. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. The federal minimum wage hasn't changed in 11 years. Democrats, they want to raise it from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour by 2025. This was included in the recent House version of the coronavirus relief package, and then it was removed by the Senate. But that doesn't mean the plan is dead.
And we will persist with the minimum wage.
If passed, the act would not only increase the standard minimum wage, it would also give that same wage by 2025 to tipped workers and teenagers who are typically paid at a lower rate. So that means that's over 100% increase on a standard minimum wage, a 500% increase for the tipped wage earners, and for youth, it's over a 200% increase. So what would the impact of all of that be? It's complicated. So we invited a few analysts and business owners to help us figure it out. Joining us now is Rachel Greszler, a research fellow in economics, budget, and entitlements at the Heritage Foundation, and Kevin Barnhill. He's the owner of Blair Meat Market in Blair, Nebraska, where you have meat processing and you sell all kinds of meat products. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're here to talk about minimum wage, and proponents point out that the federal minimum wage hasn't increased since 2009, and so it kind of sounds fair enough that it's time for an increase. But I'm wondering, Rachel, from you, if this is a potential overcorrection, since the size and the speed of this increase, I mean, is pretty unprecedented.
Well, absolutely. What we're talking about here is a more than 100% increase in the federal minimum wage, something that has never happened before. And while the minimum wage hasn't increased for about a decade now, we've actually seen a decreasing number of people who are earning the minimum wage, about an 85% reduction in the number of people who are earning it. So we're still seeing people achieving wage gains, even though there is that minimum wage at $7.25. But we also have the reality that a lot of state and local governments have already increased their own minimum wages. And that's really what makes sense here, because America is very diverse. And $15 in Mississippi would be like having a nearly $36 minimum wage in Washington, D.C.
Right, exactly. So, Kevin, how about you in Nebraska? What does this wage increase look like to you? I know so what do you pay your workers now, and what's the minimum wage there?
The minimum wage in Nebraska is $9, and that was established in 2016. I don't think we've had a real increase since then. But my lowest paid employee is at $12 an hour, and that's a part-time high school kid that comes in the afternoons. So, you know, to take that type of role, at least in Nebraska, is exactly what Rachel was saying. To take that part-time, low-wage, unskilled labor to a $15 minimum shifts the whole scale and creates just an enormous impact on small business.
So are you saying that you're going to have to increase wages all up the line to match that?
Absolutely. You know, right now there's a spread that's maintained between skilled and unskilled labor. And if you move the unskilled up to that $15 an hour, the guys that I'm currently paying 20 plus, because costs and everything are going to go up, but also because of that spread and that proportional, I'm going to have to increase their salaries to 25 or 30.
So do you think you're going to have to lay people off or restrict your hiring, or how will you manage that?
So oddly enough, we are in the middle of an expansion. And so what I would start looking at doing is, if I had to pay a $15 minimum to the lowest part-time employee that I had, is I would first I would eliminate those types of jobs. I would force or coerce my current full-time staff to pick up some of that, and then we would look hard at automation because at that point, the payback, the labor payback, would pay for equipment that I currently have low and no skilled labor working on.
So it seems like, go right ahead, Rachel.
Just going to jump in there, companies shifting to automation, we've already seen that when fast food restaurants now have kiosks for people to order from, because the reality is $15 per hour translates into over $36,000 per year in costs for an employer. And most teenagers aren't capable of earning $36,000 right out of the gate. That represents the bottom rungs on the career ladder, something to get your foot in the door, to gain some education and experience, to be able to earn a higher wage. But employers who are looking at this, their options are limited. Go to automation, reduce those jobs, and cut off the jobs that are available for lower skilled workers, and just shift it up higher, or else some companies are really going to have to go out of business because of this.
Right. So it sounds like there's gains some places and losses others. I think the Congressional Budget Office in their February 2021 report said it would raise about 900,000 people out of poverty, but we'd lose about 1.4 million jobs.
Small business is the engine that drives the American economy. I really don't care what other people say. It's the small business that employs most people in this country. And if guys like me start having to eliminate jobs, they may think they're raising people out of poverty, but the offset is not gonna work out. The other thing about this is okay. So my lowest wage is $12. I have to be competitive with other small businesses around me to even get the part-time guys, right? So all the couple of fast food restaurants, and I live in rural Nebraska. A couple of the fast food restaurants, they pay $12, right? So I have to be competitive, even though $9 is the minimum. You can't get labor for $9. So to try and force us into 15 now shifts that whole thing, and 15 may be the minimum, but just to get the labor I need, my bottom will then drop to 17 or 18, and that's where it forces me into that proportion shift on my higher end paid guys also.
So, Rachel, let me ask you a question that's not related to Kevin's business, but is related to a lot of minimum wage workers. In fact, the vast majority are in the service industry and food service industry, and they're going to be eliminating, or this bill would call for eliminating the tip credit, and basically tipped minimum wage being lower than a standard minimum wage. Can you explain the impact of that?
Yeah, so actually a majority of the people who we would measure is making the minimum wage are making less than the minimum wage. They're making something that's called the tipped minimum wage. And right now, that is a minimum of $2.13 an hour. Some restaurants might pay more than that. But it's not really a sub-minimum wage. The reality is that if you are working in a restaurant as a server and you get that $2.13 from your boss, they're required to bring you up to at least the minimum wage if you don't earn enough to bring you there with the tips. The reality is that most people who are earning the tipped minimum wage actually make closer to $15 already, including those tips, and they much prefer to have those tips there than to have a structure where restaurants do away with tipping and instead pay the workers whatever the minimum wage is. But what we're talking about here for restaurants, those business owners, is a 600% increase in some of their costs, going from that $2 an hour to $15 per hour. And we've talked to so many small independent restaurant owners who have said this will simply put them out of business. One of them, Betsy Leroy, has served the president herself. She said, I support him, but Mr. President, you're going to put me out of business with this, because they simply can't take on those new costs. We like to think, or a lot of people that are proponents of this look to big business and they say they've got deep pockets, they're making all these profits, they can afford this. But the reality is that most of the employers that are paying minimum wages are smaller business owners, and they don't have the capacity to do the equivalent of what would be increasing each of our mortgages or our rents each month. And so really, we're pitting big businesses against small businesses and driving out the little guys. It's one thing for Amazon to advocate for a $15 minimum wage because they've already automated all of their low-wage jobs out of existence. So it won't hurt them. It will just drive out their competition.
Yeah, and as someone who was in the service industry for a number of years, I can say I would much prefer the tips than a higher hourly wage, for sure. And it also kind of points out that the realities are just so different in different situations. So, Kevin, I know you're in a small town, and I guess there's not that much choice, of labor. How does that play out?
Well, and that's just it. As we were speaking, The town I live in is a town of 8,000 people, and Nebraska in general is around that 2% unemployment. We're fortunate that we're one of the lowest in the country, but the reality is I can't find people at any price. We're at a place to where there are more jobs in our town than people that could fill them, and so it gets really scary or disconcerting that labor is my number one cost right now, and then to add additional burden on a fairly thin margin business anyway could cause some real issues for me and 9 people I employ.
Yeah, Kevin, you bring up a good point there, because everybody talks about, well, if the minimum wage won't work, then what are the solutions to raising workers' wages? Because we all want people to be able to earn higher incomes out there. And the reality is it's a strong economy like you have in Nebraska and like the U.S. had prior to COVID-19. Between 2016 and 2019, we saw the wages of the lowest 10 percentile of workers increase by about 15%. And that was more than the median worker, and it was more than the highest income earner. And that was because we had that strong economy where employers had to compete for workers. And when they had to do that, they were willing to invest in them, not only through higher wages, but also through things like additional education and training that helped them out in the long run as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that competitiveness that for the worker, and that's what I'm talking about, is that I have to compete out of a limited pool. And so I can't pay minimum wage and expect people to want to work here. And then I can't just, as you said, I can't be just the same as the guy next door. I've got to offer some incentive, whether it be a career path or, we do a lot of training. So guys that start out at my lowest unskilled, we train them up into the skilled positions. And sometimes I'm training for them to go work someplace else. We only have so many of those slots available, but it's something that I can encourage them to, hey, if you work here for 2, 3, 4 years, you can go to a major grocery chain or whatever, and you'll know more than anybody else in the meat department there. So you can start in at a management level. We also offer some benefits, right? As we have a 401k, right? We're a small, very small employer, but that's important to us for the guys that work for us.
Yeah, it seems there's a lot of, there's so many particular situations that having a one-size-fits-all, solution doesn't take into account. We're going to have to wrap up shortly, but Rachel, I wanted to ask you, I know you did some research into the rising cost of childcare and what that would mean.
Yeah, so the one thing that people don't look at much is the cost increases that are come out of this, because of course businesses have to raise their prices if they face higher labor costs, and childcare in particular would be highly impacted by this because you employ a lot of workers to watch children. You can't have robots watching them, and all of the regulations, dictate the circumstances. So really, providers are going to pass the entirety of this cost increase onto families, and families already struggle both to find childcare and to be able to afford it. But my analysis, I looked across the entire U.S. and also at each individual state, and I found that a $15 minimum wage would increase childcare costs by 21% on average across the U.S. and by as much as 43% in some states. So we're talking about, on average, an extra $2,700 per year for a family who has 2 children. And so this is going to significantly impact those families, and this is going to be in addition to rising food prices and rising costs of other essential things that they have to pay for.
And if they weren't a minimum wage worker, then probably their wage didn't increase too much. All right. Any final words from you, Kevin, before we wrap up?
No, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you both.
Thanks.
So, while Kevin owns a small business in Nebraska, our next guest is on the opposite end of the spectrum. He's a New York business magnate worth millions with business interests in everything from groceries to real estate to aviation. Joining us now is John Catsimatidis. Among your many business ventures, you own New York City grocery chain Gristedes Foods and the Red Apple Group, which includes about 350 gas stations, convenience stores, truck stops across New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio. So you have a lot of workers across several states. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think the impact would be on your business of the federal minimum wage going up to $15? In New York City, it's already $15, but not the case elsewhere.
Well, the cost of living in New York City is tremendously high in comparison to other cities and in comparison to other states. So $15 an hour in New York City, we have learned to deal with it. But in other poorer towns of Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, I think it's got to be phased in over a period of time if it happens, and also phased in by if you're 16 years old living with your mother, or if you're 25 years old trying to live with your own life. So maybe between under 18 or under 21 or over 21, it'd be phased in over a period of time. It'll be much fairer to the employers and be much fairer to the people working too.
So how do you think it will impact the industries that you know well, maybe not your own business, but in general over the industries? What do you think will be the impact?
Well, in a lot of industries, a lot of people are yelling and screaming that it's going to put them out of business and they're going to make do with less workers. Everybody understands that. But that's why I'm saying the ideal thing is compromise. And let's compromise. Let's make it somewhere between here and there where it doesn't hurt anybody. It continues, the employees get to get a few dollars more depending on the area they live in and their situation, and the employers don't go out of business.
And it's a good point that you make about the phasing in according to age, because right now there is a lower wage for younger people, but they're going to phase that part out. So you think that's a mistake?
I think that's a tremendous mistake because people that are learning how to work, if they're 16 years old and they want to get tried out for a job, I think employers would like to hire some of those kids, teach them. And many times you hear stories, well, I started as a mailroom clerk and I worked myself up as chairman. Well, that mailroom clerk may never get a job for $10 an hour, $9 an hour, if the company can't afford to keep them.
So how about yourself? If you had the opportunity to hire a bunch of 16-year-olds and you'd have to pay the same rate as, your 25, 30, 40-year-olds for an entry-level job, what would you do?
Oh, well, it's not me personally, but I think my my personnel directors would tend to hire less people.
And do you think in your industries there's room for replacing jobs with automation? Is that a factor for you?
Well, Amazon is already trying to do checkouts without cashiers, depending again on the city you're in. If you're in a tough city, it's not going to happen. If you're in a less tough city, then it could happen. I know McDonald's is doing it with their cashiers and automation. It's a problem. It's going to happen eventually. So you want the kids 16 years old, 17 years old, 18 years old to have a chance to learn how to work. You don't want them in the streets.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your perspective.
Well, thank you so much.
And finally, we take a look at Seattle as a case study where a substantial raise in the minimum wage happened about 5 years ago. So we're going to see what lessons we can learn from them. And joining us now is Professor Jacob Vigdor with the National Bureau of Economic Research. Welcome, Professor. I know you're in Seattle, and in 2016, Seattle raised its minimum wage from $9.47 to $13 an hour, and you studied the impact of that. So what can we learn from the Seattle situation? What happened at that point?
Sure. Well, the real simple story of what happened in Seattle is wages went up, but hours went down. So what we did, we tracked thousands of workers who had jobs in Seattle before 2016. And we just sort of kept track of what happened to them using data on the entire Washington state workforce. We found that their wages did go up. They were earning more per hour, but their employers were cutting their hours back. They weren't necessarily laying workers off, but if you had been working 20 hours a week, a part-time job, you were finding that maybe 18 or 19 hours a week was all you would get now. So on net, workers took home slightly bigger paychecks, but a lot of that extra pay was given right back in the form of reductions in hours.
So interesting. So if hours were reduced, were they hiring more workers, or how did that work out?
What we found out, and we surveyed business owners and managers, and what they told us was they had a variety of different strategies to just try to get by with a little bit less staffing. And this could mean that the manager who's earning a salary and not an hourly wage might be doing more. It could be the owner of the small business that is doing more tasks that hourly workers might have done before. Sometimes it means asking your customers to take care of certain tasks. You know, if you eat at a restaurant, sometimes you bus the table and sometimes an employee buses a table. And that's a decision that the owner makes. And the more expensive labor gets, the more it makes sense for the business owner to say, I think I'm going to have my customer do that job.
So in terms of net impact, did it have any significant impact? Is it something you would recommend if you were back in, 2016 now?
I'd say, what we learned from Seattle kind of supported both the proponents and the opponents of minimum wage increases. Someone who advocates for a higher minimum wage is going to tell you that there are a lot of people working for low-wage jobs that are trying to raise families. It's tough to make ends meet, and this wage increase will put more money in their pockets. And we found evidence to suggest that's really true. The opponents of the minimum wage will tell you that one of the things that happens is that if you're a teenager, if you're looking for your first job, it's going to be harder to find it. And we also found evidence of that. So it's good for the older workers. It's not so good for the younger workers. And whether that's a trade-off that we should be willing to make, that's something that everybody needs to discuss, just sort of understanding that that's kind of what we're talking about. It's a trade-off.
Did you see any knockoff effects, for example, increased prices or anything like that?
We found some evidence of price increases. They were really confined to the restaurant industry. So there are low-wage workers all over the economy. You find them working in hotels, retail, you find them working in bowling alleys, etc. We did a lot of price data collection all over the local economy, grocery stores, gas stations, you name it. Restaurants were the one place where we found prices went up about 10%.
Interesting. And so when it was originally $9.47 and then it went up to $13, did you find when it was lower that there was different prices, different wages being offered, making some places more competitive than others? And did that even out when everyone was offering the same, or how did that play out?
One of the things about the Seattle labor market, even back in 2015 or earlier, it's an expensive place to live. And so the number of people in Seattle that were earning that $9.47 state minimum wage was pretty small. So one of the things that we found is, it did force some businesses to raise their wages. But the success rate, only about 7 out of every 1,000 businesses closed as a result of raising the minimum wage. So 99.3% of businesses figured out a way to make things work. And sometimes that meant raising prices. Sometimes that meant cutting back a little bit on worker hours so that your payroll didn't go up quite that much.
So that's really interesting. So what's your overall assessment? One of the things I was talking about with another guest is that, the country, there's very different circumstances around the country. So you've seen an urban example here. How do you think it might play out, somewhere less urbanized, a smaller place, a place with a lower cost of living?
Yeah, what works in Seattle does not necessarily work all across the country. One local phenomenon we've seen here over the past 10 years, we've got tens of thousands of tech workers moving to Seattle every year. They're paid very high salaries. They've got a lot of money to spend. So if they go to the coffee shop and they find that their latte costs $5 instead of $4, okay, they'll just pay the $5 for a cup of coffee. There are some parts of the country where you don't have that kind of cash floating around, where you have more people on fixed incomes, more people working in a lower wage industry. And without that surplus cash floating around the economy, it may be a little bit harder for businesses to figure out ways to make the higher wages work.
Very interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your insights.
All right. You bet. Thanks for having me.
And coming up after the break, why does unionizing pose such a threat to Amazon? But first, here's America Q&A, where we hear what regular Americans think about raising the federal minimum wage.
I've never met anyone that disagreed with that.
No, I don't, because I'm concerned that it's going to limit the opportunities for job opportunities on the lower end of the scale.
I think it's nonsense that we're even discussing it. I think it should be a thing.
It's the wrong move. It's going to put more people out of work.
Everything else is going up. They might as well have that go up too.
There are different locations that can adequately pay that amount, but for the standard amount of stores and the commerce that's going on, the $15 an hour is just way too much.
I think it's hard for people to live, on the current minimum wage is extremely low.
I think you should have it. You better believe it.
No, I do not. I believe that a lot of places are paying $15 minimum wage and up. If that's where you want to work, it should not be mandated.
We desperately need that. I hate to see people who are working poor and still struggling to pay their bills.
With the U.S. dollar and the amount that service workers are being paid right now is not adequate enough.
I like the idea of people on minimum wage being able to survive.
Yes, I do support it, but to be honest, I wonder if, because we can have the $15 an hour, but the insurance, the rent, mortgage, they go up. There's still no difference.
No, I don't. The market economy will dictate what someone should get.
I think what the minimum wage is now is not enough by the way of inflation. Then people are going to have to realize that if we start paying everybody a minimum of $15, prices are going to go up on a lot of things that, just daily items.
They should raise it, for the poor people that are at a disadvantage.
Do it across the board. I don't think that's fair to all, especially those who've already been working that maybe work their way up to that. And I don't know if they're going to bring them up.
Yes. For sure. It needs to be raised.
I think it's fine for a place like New York City, but it certainly isn't fine for a place like West Virginia.
I'm not really sure because at the end of the day, everything will inflate, so it'll just end up being exactly the same situation for everyone.
About a year ago, Amazon opened a fulfillment center in Bessemer, Alabama, near Birmingham. Soon, union organizers began waiting day and night at the factory gates to try to sign up its nearly 6,000 workers. They succeeded in getting enough signatures to hold a vote on unionizing. Mail-in ballots, a new measure introduced because of the pandemic, are due at the end of the month. If it goes through, it would be a big deal, since Amazon has, over its 25-year history, so far avoided unions. Joining us now to explain these fascinating dynamics is Dr. Robin Gaster. He literally wrote the book on Amazon called Behemoth, Amazon Rising, Power and the Seduction in the Age of Amazon. It came out this month, and if you're wondering, it is available on Amazon. We'll come back for that interview in a few minutes, and we will just move on for a moment. Go to our next interview, and we'll come back to him. So on our next topic, about 2.1 million people are incarcerated in America. 95% of them will be released back into their communities, and about 75% of them will end up back in jail within 5 years. Clearly, some things, probably many things, aren't right. Our next guests take us into a maximum security prison to shed light on one very important question. Could a different approach to justice create better outcomes? Joining us now is Catherine Hervey. She's the director, producer, and writer of The Prisoner Within. And Troy Williams, he's one of the stars of the film, whose story, well, we'll hear some more about. Catherine, I just wanted to start by saying congratulations on making a really excellent film. I have to say I was extremely touched. It was a very moving story. And it was just so amazing to get to know these prisoners as people, and people, who are trying so hard to to look inside, change themselves, really understand what happened. And it was all through this, this process of restorative justice and this particular program at San Quentin. So could you just start by explaining what that is for us?
The film follows a group of men as well as some survivors who are coming in from the outside and who are also facilitators of the program. It's called the Victim Offender Education Group. And it uses restorative justice philosophies to first help the men, and then this also happens in women's prisons as well, to really connect the dots of their lives that led to their crime. And that is really, to me, the most important part of the film, and it's something that's really missing in our criminal justice system, because what it causes them to do is to go back and really unpack all of the trauma that has happened in their lives that has led to their crime, but more importantly, to also take full accountability for their actions, right? So none of this is used as an excuse. It's not okay that people committed violence against other people, but that if we don't really start unpacking our lives and unpacking the trauma that occurs to us and that occurs to the men in the film, then basically people are just going to come right back out and, the traumatic cycle starts all over again. So the program and the film is about healing. It's about restorative justice versus retributive justice. And a big component of this is that the facilitators themselves are survivors. And then at one point in the film, we bring in this other woman, Dion Wilson, that we've been following, who comes in and sits with the men in circle that we've been following. And they heal together.
It's just so amazing to watch that unfold on camera, and we'll talk more about that later. Troy, you're one of the stars of the film. As I said, you spent a number of years in San Quentin and the prison system in general. Can you tell us a bit about your story, how you came to be there, what you did, but then also how you came to the place where you could heal in the way that Catherine was just talking about?
I participated in the takeover robbery of a computer parts company. And as a result of that, I ultimately was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. So going into prison, I knew that I had to do some things to try to unravel my past. I had to ask myself this question: how did I literally go from being an innocent kid who would not step on an ant to being a gun-toting, gang-banging felon willing to put a gun to somebody's head and rob them? What happened in my life that got me to that point? And through a lot of soul searching and a lot of reflection and a lot of, awakening and realization and processing groups, I came to understand a lot about myself and what got me there. I realized that there were things that got me away from the values that my mother, my father, my grandparents, and my great-grandmother tried to instill in me. And because of what was going on in the community, the world was telling me not to be violent, but yet all I saw around me was violence. All I saw around me were things that led me to believe that I would not live to be a certain age, and that the only way for me to survive was to become a very aggressive individual myself. And so one of the things that I did, I started gangbanging. And when I went to jail, my brother was murdered. And what I realized from sitting in jail is that here it was, my mother had lost one son to the street. She was about to lose another son to the prison system. And nothing I had actually did protected my brother, and nothing that I was going to do was actually going to bring my brother back. And that was the initial start of my journey inward, is me really starting to take a look at how did I get to this point? How did I get so far away from the teachings of my parents that it led me inside of this system where I was in many ways not expected to ever return?
Wow. And I know the kind of programs that you participated in and that the film is about are pretty rare in prison. Is that right? Not a lot of people have these sorts of opportunities.
Oh, very much so. Especially, I can't speak for other states, and I have been to quite a few different states, and all you seem to see in most states is this lockdown, lock them up sort of mentality. And that is what America, in essence, has been practicing for the past 40 years, and it hasn't worked. It doesn't work. I mean, the harder a person got to me, the harder I became. It wasn't until somebody showed some empathy toward me that I learned how to empathize toward others.
You talked about the lockdown and the lack of these programs. I just want to play a short clip from the film that speaks to both of those very powerfully.
We have been told that the state punishing people, literally harming people to show people that harming people is wrong, is the only option for accountability. Prison is criminogenic. Prison produces crime. It's like completely counterintuitive that we send anyone to a thing that makes it more likely that they're going to commit more crimes. And I'm not even talking about places like San Quentin where there's actually programming, but the vast majority of prisons across this country have nothing to help people figure out how to turn their lives around.
So, Troy, can you just quickly tell us, those cages that we just saw in that clip, what is that? I found it a little bit shocking, actually, to see what life really looks like inside.
Those are where they send human beings out to have recreation. They place them inside of a cage because the only way that we have been taught or trained or thought of to deal with people considered violent is to put them in a cage and lock them up and pretend that that is going to be the cure-all to our problem. And I would love for the audience also to recognize that, I spent half of my life, in a cage that was 4 feet by 10 feet, like with two human beings. I'm 6'2", well over 250 pounds. And I was put in this cage with another human being, probably equally or bigger than me. And we were forced to live. This was our restroom. This was our kitchen. This was our bathroom. This was our eating area. This was our sleeping area. And we were forced to live in that and treated less than human, where, if you saw animals locked in a cage that small, people would be in an uproar about it. So we have to do better with regards to how we are allowing our youth to fall through the cracks, and then we're allowing a society to walk away with this concept that lock them up is a cure-all to all of the problems that we have in this country.
So, Catherine, I wanted to ask you, I know that you're an attorney and you were teaching inside the prison system as well, certainly before you made this film. What was that like for you as an outside person coming into that? And I guess this, probably led to why you wanted to make this film.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I was going into a men's prison as a volunteer college instructor. You start going in every week, you're developing relationships with these men. And I very, very, very quickly realized that most of the men that I was teaching, that I was interacting with, they all had life without parole. So, to this day, they're still in prison and sentenced to die in prison. And what I really started seeing with these men and the way that they interacted with each other, the way they interacted with me, the way they interacted with themselves, was really deep levels of integrity and accountability and, a lot of heart in terms of how they spoke, how they acted. They really, really took responsibility for themselves. And then I would go out into the world where, theoretically we're supposed to be acting better. And I would be disappointed. I would be disappointed with the levels of integrity, accountability, And this was a really huge disconnect for me. This was very, very hard for me to reconcile, because I felt like, why are these men in here considered beyond redemption? And they're showing themselves to be of much greater heart and integrity than most people that I meet on the outside world. These men, and there's women as well, need to be out, and they need to be leaders in our community, teaching us, how to not recidivate, how to stop these cycles of trauma.
Yeah, there's a powerful moment in the film where, is it Sam, that he talks about, passing on the lessons to his own children.
Programs that I learned in here in Vogue, I sit with my kids them in the visiting room, and I teach them it. I ask them what they feel and explain to me what happened that day, and I try to use the work to help them, guide them. That's my debt to society. And it hurts because it took coming to prison for us to wake up. It's not prison did it, but something clicked. It was that aha moment that woke us up and to realize what we did.
One of the things, speaking of that is mentioned many times in the film that's really impactful is that, hurt people hurt. Dion, her husband, was a police officer and was killed. And then she felt this rage and wanted to, see the perpetrator murdered. Literally, she fought very hard for the death penalty, and then came to realize that her hurt was making her want to hurt. Troy, maybe can you speak to that from your own experience?
It's unfortunate that I received the title of ex-felon, but I never received the title of crime survivor. Like most of the guys inside have at some point themselves been victims of criminal behavior, been victims of crime themselves. And oftentimes we find ourselves unprotected by forces that are meant to protect us. We find ourselves not being protected by the very law enforcement that is supposed to protect us. And so we lash out. We try to find ways to, protect ourselves. And ultimately that leads us to hurting other people. And I identify so much with Dion is because, she was real about it. She wasn't going to do anything herself, but she had a whole system that was going to back her and support her in that thought frame that I have been hurt, and therefore I have to hurt somebody else. I have to make sure that the person that hurt me feels my hurt or feels that pain, and I want to lash out. I want to say this, and this is very, very important, that the men that you see in this film, and oftentimes what is never shown in other films, like, we are the creators of this program. We are not just the participants of this program. We are also the creators, and we work alongside with outside people to produce the results that you see now coming out of prison systems in California and really all across the country, where we have had the opportunity to step into leadership positions and say, no, we want to heal. We have a tool set. We know that people in the community have a tool set. How do we work together in a restorative way to heal our community? We have to do it together. We can't do it individually. We need your help, and advice in turn. Our help is needed, and we also deserve and need a seat at the table of transformation.
I'm so glad you raised that, because I know since you got out in 2014 that you've been doing exactly that work.
I learned this. I can't demonize all of law enforcement no more than I can sanctify all of my homies in the hood. And so what I learned is that the individuals is what make up the system, and we have to come together. The people who came into my life and blessed me, whether they were prison guards, whether they were, outside volunteers, or even a lot of the guys on the tier. I learned the truth about my history from a black man on the prison tier. And so I give credit to all of those people who came in and helped, me to see things differently about my life, so I can relive and honor the values that my mother, father, and grandparents tried to teach me.
Very inspiring. Thank you so much. We have to go now, but Catherine, can you tell us where can people see this film?
Yeah, right now it's out on iTunes, Comcast, Xfinity, Vimeo, YouTube, Microsoft, pretty much all of the video on demand channels. You can find the film.
Wonderful. Right. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, well, we've got Dr. Greszler back on the line now to talk about Amazon. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask Americans to tell us what pandemic-related changes they think are here to stay.
I think eventually the new normal will become abnormal. Didn't it do that after the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918? It was followed by the Roaring '20s. What could be more normal?
I think that it's just going to exaggerate trends that we've already seen. Like brick and mortar retail has been declining, e-commerce has been expanding.
Probably the work from home situation. I think a lot of companies are realizing that they don't need employees in person.
I think and hope that communicating with loved ones in creative ways, video chatting, it definitely increased for me and my family.
Probably people will be most hesitant to be around large groups.
Being as comfortable as they were before, there's always going to be the little thing in the back of everyone's mind. There was a pandemic.
Washing your hands, just doing that normal stuff that you should already be taking those steps regardless, but probably doing it a lot more. It's probably going to be the 6-foot distancing, all that stuff.
I think one big change is that business is not going to have to fly their employees across the country and across the world for seminars.
I think with children being at it was a disadvantage. I think that coming back from that is going to be a struggle.
Online, teaching a lot more. They'll incorporate that a lot more.
For our family, I think realizing that busyness is not a necessity.
The outcome for the kids in terms of long term is going to be significant. We've seen kids disproportionately in areas where schools are closed.
Probably not a lot of mass gatherings, and I think masking.
Probably the social distancing and the mask wearing, I guess.
People will be more cautious in not catching this virus.
I think you'll be wearing masks.
There will be some balance of work from home.
Virtual learning has come about. We'll see more and more of that.
I think there will definitely be some adjustments all businesses will have to make, but I think everyone seems to be adapting. I honestly don't think a lot of the changes that have happened so far, like online classes, will be permanent, because doing that would be bad for colleges.
All right, we have Dr. Greszler back with us now. Can we see there? Excellent. So we're all working. So glad we could make this work, because for me this is a very interesting topic. And as I was starting to say, it's not just because this is a story of, union seeks to conquer the giant. It's so interesting because of the kind of company that Amazon is. I just want to read your description of Amazon. You describe it very provocatively as a brilliant, agile, cold, efficient, amoral, incredibly innovative, secretive, scary, and seductive. That's a pretty amazing description. So given this very unique set of qualities, can you explain to us why unions are seen as such a threat?
Yeah, I think there are really two sides to that. Look, many American businesses have been anti-union, and that's sort of for practical purposes, if you like. It's easier to manage your workforce if you don't have to deal with unions. That's pretty clear. If you give your workforce an additional voice and expertise, that makes it harder to manage them. On the other hand, there are things about Amazon itself which are unique. Most big companies want you to comply. They want you to be part of the team, but they want you mostly just to follow the rules. And Amazon is different. Amazon wants much more commitment. It is more of a missionary organization. It's not really interested in mercenaries. And they are there to serve the customer. That is the core of their culture. Jeff Bezos has said it many, many times. We want to be the most customer-centric company on earth. And this means that the cultural hold on Amazon is very deep. And in a certain way, unions are not just a sort of practical statement that workers want more rights. It's a statement that they do not believe in the Amazon mission, that they, or at least that they don't buy into the Amazon mission in the way that Amazon wants and Amazon needs. And Amazon has historically been successful in finding people to do that. So it's much more personal. And I think that needs to be taken into account.
So I know that Amazon is already paying, $15 an hour minimum wage, which I think Bernie Sanders had praised them for doing that when they raised the minimum wage. And, they have 401ks and, other benefits. But what kinds of things might the workers be looking for in unionizing? Especially speaking to some of those adjectives that you threw in there in describing the company.
The work in the workforce, in the warehouse, is tremendously demanding. It's physically incredibly demanding. Anybody who has a chance of going to visit an Amazon warehouse should do so. It is the future manifest right there. And workers have to work. So most people there are pickers or stowers. They pick up items or they put them away. And there is technology all around them. There's technology guiding them to where they need to be, where they need to put things, what they need to pick up. It's very physically demanding work. You have to bend and stretch and move quickly. And in front of you is a big clock that counts the number of seconds since the last time you did that action. And on average, Amazon expects you to do that action every 12 seconds, and the clock is there watching you. If you fail, you get written up, and 6 write-ups, and the algorithm will recommend that you be fired. And the write-ups could be for arriving late, it could be for having too many breaks, taking too long to get to a bathroom, talking to other employees. It's a pretty rigidly controlled environment. So one can imagine that what, especially in cases where management was seen as being unfair for some reason, or the tremendous strains imposed by COVID, one can imagine that workers would get unhappy, and eventually someone would try and start a union.
And isn't there also sort of a tiered system where they rank everybody and the bottom tier gets fired? Is that right?
Yeah, Amazon won't confirm that, but the evidence is pretty strong. There's one deposition from a lawsuit, an Amazon deposition, which showed that Amazon released, for productivity reasons, about 30% of its workers at a Baltimore warehouse over 13 months. And given that you can imagine many, many more left during that period because they couldn't handle the workload or for other reasons, there's a tremendous amount of turnover there. And that certainly makes it more difficult to create a union.
Right. I would expect that. So is that the main factor, or are there other factors which account for the fact that Amazon's been able to keep unions at bay for 25 years? I know Jeff Bezos gets some criticism for that.
Well, look, for a long time they were paying above average wages, and that helped. They gave health care, that helped. If you last long enough, you can invest in their 401k, but I don't know how many people do that. So on the other hand, it's really difficult. It's very difficult to unionize in high turnover workplaces. You have to get union cards signed to get an election. Many of those people may have left by the time the election comes around. So it's difficult. And that explains possibly why efforts elsewhere have failed. Amazon also takes its own actions. If you have a lot of turnover, it's fairly easy to turn over the union organizers as well. And there's a lawsuit pending in Staten Island about that. And more generally, the U.S. is not terribly, the labor law is not terribly helpful to the unions. Unlike some European countries where there is sectoral bargaining, or at least company level bargaining, to unionize Amazon is going to be like World War I. You have to unionize every single facility separately. So it's like, you know, bayonets and mustard gas. It's not shock and awe. And I also think that Amazon could respond. I mean, let us say that Bessemer unionizes. Amazon will notice that, and it's possible that work will flow elsewhere. I mean, that, you know, the auto industry managed to change its supply chain so that Detroit wasn't dominant anymore. So, you know, there are other options. And finally, let's say they win. Amazon can come back in a year and ask for another election if it can get 30% of the workers to sign a card. So even wins are not permanent. It's difficult.
So you're not optimistic that this effort will be successful? I guess it will know in about 10 days or so.
Bessemer might be successful. I really don't have an opinion. I'm not on the ground there. It's not close enough. We will see more of this. Definitely. We'll see more efforts to unionize because Amazon is squeezing everybody. So everybody on the production side is being squeezed. So we're going to see more of them. I'm just pointing out that it's not like opening a door and it floods in. It really isn't like that. It's trench warfare, and it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of different efforts to get it done. So.
That's interesting to hear because I was reading articles, you know, where other plants are watching what's happening in Alabama. But, you know, as you explain, it's a lot more complicated than that. I think we've got to wrap up. We're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us. It's extremely interesting to speak with you.
Thank you very much.
And that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks. Be sure to join us every Saturday at 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, have a great week.
Don't let YouTube decide what information you get. That's your choice. YouTube is deleting our videos and cuts you off from a source of honest reporting. Make sure you don't lose access to NTD's news content, and take a quick moment to subscribe to our newsletter so no matter what happens here, you'll keep your access to a trustworthy news